all of them want to maximize opportunity to participate in their sport. And all of them want to respect gender identity. But they also want to deliver fair competition conditions to female athletes. And biological differences between the two sexes mean the only way to do that is by creating separate competition categories for male and female athletes. That takes me to my third point, which is that means the governing body has to decide what to do in those cases, exceptional cases, trans cases and DSD cases, where biological sex and gender do not match, where you have people who are biologically male, but their gender identity, whether from birth or from a later period, is female. And to do that, to decide what to do, whether sex or gender should trump, you have to go back to the reason why you've created the separate competition categories in the first place. And the reason you've done that is because for everyone to have an equal and fair chance to win, you have to divide people who've been through male puberty from people who've been through female puberty. And you have to do that because male puberty confers physiological advantages that mean the competition would be between male and female would be like between a heavyweight and a lightweight, between one age group and another age group. And that's absolutely not to belittle female competition. In fact, it is to try to celebrate it, to celebrate the best by creating a separate competition category. In other words, in this particular case, and not in many others, there are plenty of social situations where it just doesn't matter. But in this situation, the other analogy we always draw, the other situation is in a doctor's office, you have to distinguish between sex and gender. Same is true on the sports field. It's biology that matters, it's biology that's determinative, and therefore sex has to trump gender. First was after the Duty Chan case, when the rules were suspended for 2 years. Handelsman paper came out, which debunked a couple of arguments that were made in Chand. One was that there's no difference between testosterone levels of males and females, an argument that was only made by including in the female category the testosterone levels of DSD, 46XY DSD athletes who were biologically male and therefore had male hormone testosterone levels. That there was a study published that debunked that and showed that the female testosterone range is roughly 0.5 to 3 nanomoles per liter, and the men's roughly 8 to 30 or more. Two completely different populations. And then the Handelsman paper built on that by showing that it is testosterone and the difference in those testosterone levels that drives the physiological differences that emerge sometimes before, but mainly at male puberty. And those are differences in muscle mass and strength, differences in bone length and therefore height, differences in amount of hemoglobin in the blood and therefore amount of blood and oxygen driven to the muscles, all of the things that create the different physiological and therefore sex competition capabilities. That was an important point because in the Chan case, when I look back on it, the nonsense that was argued by the scientists in that case is truly remarkable. The second key point was in Rio in 2016, because the rules had been suspended because I did such a bad job in Chand. And because of that, the rules were suspended. There were no restrictions. And the result was that the 3 medalists in the women's 800 meters in Rio, I was there, I saw it, were all 46XY DSD athletes. So that exploded any semblance of any argument that there was no male advantage. But it's not just them. Plenty of other 46XY DSD athletes at very high levels of the sport. But actually, it doesn't matter what level you're at, because whatever level you're at, it's unfair competition and you're displacing a female athlete from their rightful place. The next thing that happened was, in the lead up to the Semenya case, we changed the rules. In Chand, we hadn't realized the importance of distinguishing between biological sex and gender. And that led to an opportunity for certain of the witnesses to create confusion by talking about us discriminating between women, and arguing about the need, creating a need for us to prove that testosterone levels determine performance in women within the female category, which of course with such a tiny range of testosterone can't be true. But what is true, that the massive difference in testosterone levels between biological males and biological females is what determines the sex performance differences between those two categories. So we cleared that up in Semenya by insisting from the beginning that a distinction has to be drawn between biological sex and gender, and it is biological sex that counts for determining eligibility for the female category. And that changed the case. Need to be proportionate. They need to go no further than is necessary to achieve their objective. And that led to a series of attempts to deal with the problem through testosterone suppression. But quite apart from the practical problems that caused, the science is now clear that you can't take away the advantage by suppressing testosterone. And that, I think, is now an accepted consensus. And even if you could, you still have to factor in the physiological disadvantages of female puberty. So why are we back to the SRY gene? Because the testing is non-intrusive and effective. It is, as you mentioned, a screen only. The rules say you still have to consider if you could be eligible because of false positives and because of complete androgen insensitivity. The rules were abandoned back in the 1990s after the Maria Patino case, a complete androgen insensitivity case, but brought back in after Paris 2024, after the UN Special Rapporteur decried what had happened in the boxing competition in Paris and confirmed that SRY testing was simple, efficient, dignified, not invasive, cheap, and reliable. And so it is proving.
From the perspective of arguing against these regulations on behalf of athletes, rather than from the perspective of World Athletics and the federations, which I think Jonathan has aptly set out. I'm going to start with an overarching view of what we say was a misguided effort to regulate women with differences in sexual development. The IOC's new rules say that only biological females can compete and that they can verify who is biologically female by the SRY gene screen. But we know that nature's not neat. This rule excludes women who are born female, recorded female at birth, raised as girls and women, and identify and live as women. The issue is not here about a biological lane change. It is about women living and competing the way they're born. Genetics is complicated. Most successful athletes around the world have genetic variants or mutations that make them exceptional, whether they're taller than the competitors, have a larger wingspan, enhanced eyesight, elevated lung capacity. These are all differences in genetics that we celebrate in sport. So why do we treat genetic variations of women with differences in sexual development differently? Why do we discriminate against these genetic variations when we celebrate all others? Again, we're talking here about women who are born female, recorded at birth as female, raised as girls and women, and identify as female. Yet somehow the natural genetics of these women, it is argued, make it unfair. And the IOC says that for sport, they can no longer be classified as biological women, even though that's how they are born and how they identify. And there may be, as you've heard from Mr. Taylor already today, complexities in the science and the biology, but the humanity here is simple. Excluding women from sport because of their natural genetics inflicts profound, irreversible harm, humiliation, stigma, mental health impacts, identity injuries, and clear lost careers and earnings for those affected. That harm, it is argued, far outweighs any unfairness about protecting the female category from the incredibly small number of women born in this world with genetic differences in sexual development. On a human level, we should reject this rule and its predecessors. All it serves to do is exclude from sport global heroines like Caster Semenya, an athlete I note whose success, while tremendous, to put it in context, she has won less often and by a smaller margin than Usain Bolt. Mr. Taylor mentioned 3 medals that were won at the Olympic Games in Rio, but there were 2,488 medals awarded in Rio, and he's focused on 3. Ms. Semenya has been subjected by my count to no less than 4 different regulatory regimes over the course of her career, all as part of an ever-changing effort by international sports federations to define what it means to be a woman in sport, instead of repeatedly and systemically discriminating against them and inflicting massive and irreversible harm on a very small minority of women who are born with differences in sexual development. The IOC is resurrecting today a regime of genetic sex verification that it abandoned before the Sydney Olympics in 2000. And it abandoned that regime after decades of scientific inaccuracy, false positives, and ethical criticism. That history includes the so-called nude parades, when women were required to undergo visual inspection of their genitalia, bar body smears, and even the SRY PCR assays. All of those were dropped historically because the science was deemed poor and the resulting harm to athletes extreme. In the Duty Sean case, Dr. Arne Lindqvist, the former IOC medical director, testified, and he referred to this period of prior testing regimes as a history of ignorance. The 2026 policy that the IOC has now put out is resurrecting these previously discredited sex testing regimes. And that's hard to reconcile with the IOC's position in 2021. In 2021, the IOC released a framework that was developed after a 2-year consultation with more than 250 stakeholders. The result? The IOC cautioned against presuming a disproportionate advantage and urged sports-specific evidence-based criteria and the respect for human rights. The new regulation that's come out in 2026, which resurrects this old concept of sex testing, is a stark reversal, and it raises, from those opposed to it, serious questions. How accurate and reliable is the testing? The IOC's public rationale stresses fairness and safety, but the IOC hasn't published the scientific record that it's relying upon in support of this new rule. There are concerns that have been expressed about the science the IOC is relying on, and that science is hotly contested by others in the field. There are unquestionably biological differences between women who are born with differences in sexual development as compared to a biological cis male. And there are no published peer-reviewed evidence that supporting the presence of the SRY gene itself predicating on or supporting enhanced athletic performance. That's one concern. Another concern is consent. Genetic testing in these circumstances is being coerced. There's not meaningful consent. And that testing is not accompanied, as far as we understand it, by independent counseling for those athletes who may test positive. I put in air quotes. How do we get consent from minors who are subjected to this regime? And there are a litany of concerns under various privacy statutes in countries around the world to use genetic testing and related health data for eligibility criteria in sport. There's also been arguments advanced already about whether or not these rules violate the safe sport maltreatment regimes, and in particular, whether they violate the Universal Code of Conduct to prevent and address maltreatment in sport. And arguments have been raised that questioning a woman's identity and subjecting her to follow-on clinical examinations is demeaning, belittling, humiliating, and intimidating, constituting psychological maltreatment and discrimination. And then lastly, and most significantly, the battleground that Mr. Taylor and I have found ourselves on in these cases in the past is discrimination. Mandatory SRY testing and the exclusionary criteria now promulgated by the IOC are prima facie discriminatory. And this discrimination needs to be justified, and the regulation that is now put forward gives rise to a litany of harms that suggest it cannot be justified as proportionate. And all of these concerns together tie up into material resulting harm from the new rules that are amplified in this case because it's the IOC who's promulgating them. The IOC recommends early genetic screening by national federations. Well, what does that mean? That means that this new form of sex testing will spread into selection camps, training centers, and national competitions, magnifying the harm of this rule on a global scale.
DSD athletes are not the same as transgender, and we need to separate those two. They're very distinct categories, and we're not always talking about the same thing.
We now know even more about pre-puberty, and that male-female gaps are significant even in newborns. Newborn males have a greater grip strength than females. Why do we have sex categories? I'm not aware of any rule or any category that sport has that is not very strictly enforced, that is not policed, that is not enforced. So I think the question is, well, how do we do it? It's not whether we do it. If somebody does have a DSD, they are 18,000 times more likely to be in the finals than a woman would be. So I'm aware of no other rule in sport, and I'll get to that, that is enforced or policed with gusto, but the women's sports category is somehow not. My Olympic career was only possible because of the women's category, the female category. So it was a huge win on March 26th, as Tracey was saying earlier, that a two-time Olympic gold medalist swimmer, Christy Coventry, announced a new policy on the protection of female women's sports. Kathy Devine's research shows that women overwhelmingly are in favor of sex testing to assure that women's sports were just for women, over 80%. So today I offer you the lens of both a female athlete and as a civil rights lawyer. I was one of the many Olympic athletes that gave up almost everything for the pursuit of excellence. I was sex tested. I was drug tested repeatedly, dozens of times, if not hundreds. Sex testing consists of a cheek swab, and it is far less intrusive than COVID testing. Whereas drug testing involves giving blood, of letting a testing authority know where you are 24/7. It's called whereabouts. It involves having a stranger show up and knock at the door in the morning with an empty container that the person has to watch the urine leave the body. Women who do not identify with their sex nonetheless compete in the women's sports category. So as long as they have not medicalized, so female differences in sport. I was never on a girls or a women's swimming team. I was only on the swimming team. So that was high school, college, national teams, etc. And the male-female gap is about 11%. Our biological sex differences demand formal government-sanctioned sex-segregated sports. Third, keeping males out of female sports is an inclusive measure, and it is possible under the law. So sports is constructed to provide diversity, and in part that structure is required to require sex segregation in the women's sports category. So sport achieves diversity, equity, and inclusion through categories. And you all see this when you watch the Olympics, right? You have the weight categories, the age categories, the physical and mental disabilities, the geography, sex categories. All sport categories exclude for the fairness and inclusion of other competitors. I'm just thrilled that the IOC has now excluded males from female sports. It'll make formal state-sanctioned sex segregation for sports, for girls and women in sport, for the inclusion of girls and women worldwide. The sex discrimination against women in opportunities, scholarship dollars, and how they get treated is pervasive, and we really need to be focused on that. I'm thrilled that we've made progress after progress. We've got the NCAA, we've got the NAIA, we've got the USOC, we've got many international federations who have now said that women's sports are for female.
This policy will harm women, it will harm girls, and the harm will fall hardest on those who are already most vulnerable. The IOC tells us this policy is science-led. Let me tell you that the scientists, what the actual scientists really say. Let's talk about Andrew Sinclair, who is a geneticist who discovered the SRY gene in 1990. He's the person whose work the IOC is citing to justify this policy. He has called its reintroduction, and I'm quoting him directly, extremely surprising and ill-advised. He has written publicly that an SRY test tells you only whether the gene is present. It does not tell you whether there are particular developments internally because of that gene, whether testosterone is produced or whether the body responds to it. The man who discovered the gene is telling the IOC this test cannot do what they are claiming. We have heard the same from Eric Villa, one of the world's foremost geneticists, specializing in intersex conditions, who has also said that no single gene determines sex-related characteristics. The Human Genetics Society of Australasia has confirmed that SRY testing, and I quote, does not provide any biological or medically specific information regarding performance enhancement. The European Society of Human Genetics has stated that the test result cannot determine completely whether an individual should compete in the female category. And most recently, many of you may have noticed that FIMS, the International Federation of Sport Medicine, has gone further and said that eligibility regulations require physicians to act in deliberate breach of their ethical duties to act. This is not a fringe view. This is the international body representing sports medicine professionals, and they are talking about the lack of evidence, scientific evidence in this policy. There is not a single published peer-reviewed study linking the SRY gene to athletic performance. The IOC calls this a non-invasive cheek swab. But what is really non-invasive? If you're just talking about the method of a cheek swab actually, they are doing both, either cheek swab. If I talk about how World Athletics have been implementing it, they're doing either cheek swab or blood tests as well. Now, the method of cheek swab might seem to be something that's non-invasive. But to call this entire thing non-invasive is inaccurate because what happens after a positive SRY result is invasive. If there is a positive SRY result, the IOC policy talks about to find out whether this athlete has a complete androgen insensitivity syndrome or a rare form of DSD, which might give this athlete no advantage. So in order to find that out, if the athlete wants to go ahead and do that, that is quite an invasive procedure. And we have seen this happening over and over again. And our athletes have spoken about it. About how I can quote from, one of these Kenyan athletes who spoke about, they took me to the Nairobi hospital for the testing. They undressed me, I'm quoting, in front of a man, the doctor. I remember that day, so emotional. He opened my legs. So, we see these kind of comments. I have, obviously in this, many years now, have come across athletes who have been, traumatized, have been in depression, have taken into, different kinds of substance abuse post this experience. There was one case where the athlete, died by suicide after such intervention. So we need to take into account the impact that this is going to have. And this is just not non-invasive. Another very crucial point, and I'm conscious of time, is safeguarding. I believe this policy is a safeguarding disaster. And why do I say that? Because we are talking about Youth Olympics as well. The IOC has just introduced a policy that, mandating genetic testing of children. The IOC's entire safeguarding framework for minors is a single sentence: international federations should maintain specific safeguards for minors. That is it. No enforceable standards, no accountability, no resource allocation, a single sentence delegated to underfunded national federations across more than 200 countries. Here is what the IOC has not grappled with. In many of these communities where the athletes most affected by this policy come from, across East Africa, across South Asia, intersex variations are associated with profound stigma, beliefs rooted in tradition, religion, and fear. The documented consequences of intersex disclosure within families include abandonment, forced surgical intervention, and in documented cases in Uganda, Kenya, and South Asia, violence. The African intersex movement has explicitly called for an end to what they describe as tradition-led killings of intersex people. The IOC's requirement for parental notification of genetic test results is not a safeguard. In these contexts, it is a mechanism for harm. A girl who tests positive, or even if a girl doesn't test positive, often girls are not allowed to compete. They are not getting any support from their families to compete in sport. You are asking them to go back to their families to seek consent. That is in itself putting them to risk. So this is not a theoretical concern. Having worked with athletes for 20 years, this is what I have experienced. And I'm not talking about athletes in the global north. I'm mainly talking about athletes in the global south. We have seen several legal experts raising this, writing joint letter. The IOC is saying that their policy is backed by science. However, the IOC has refused to name a single scientist on its working group. There has been no transparency. It conducted a consultation, it will not publish. It adopted a policy that it has no mechanism to implement safely. And it has delegated the protection of children to federations that have no capacity to provide it. We are not asking the IOC to choose between fairness and inclusion. We are asking it to choose between policy and evidence. That's what even FIMS talked about. Between institutional authority and scientific integrity. Between a checkbox and genuine consultation with the women most affected. Caster Semenya has said it plainly. The policy is walking backwards. This is not inevitable. Policies made by institutions can be unmade by institutions, but only when these institutions are willing to listen and willing to be held accountable. Only if they are behaving, they are accountable. That is what we are here for. And I'm really interested in the trickle-down effect of these policies on kids in recreational sport, in grassroots sport, and kids who are gender non-conforming, but any girl across, not only playing sport, but anyone, even outside sport, the impact of these policies outside competitive sport. What are we doing about that?
In some countries, it's illegal for these sorts of tests to take place. And I did ask the IOC president about that in a press conference. And she said, well, they can just go and get tested in a third country. That might be easy if you come from one of the wealthy nations with a lot of support and enables you to do that. But some of the athletes that you're talking about, Payoshni, are not in that situation at all.
When I was at primary school, during sports time, my mother could just see me from the window, sneaking to go and run. And she could not allow me to go and run because she didn't know I was once going to be a runner. And she could say running was not for girls because those days, girls were so much involved in running. But I had these feelings inside me. When I saw people running, I wanted to join them. And I did not stop joining them. I joined them and I slowly started realizing I could run. That's when I was still in primary. And that one gave me ability to support my family. Mostly when my father fell sick, that running came with discrimination and scrutiny, especially of my body and who I am when I was a woman. They refused to recognize her. So I didn't fully understand. But I felt something was not in order, or something was wrong. So after, when I joined run in national level, I saw it happening to someone I knew. That was my teammate called Annette Negesa. She started doing well in running. Then after, suddenly she just disappeared from running. So I asked myself, what is happening? Right before the London Olympics, Annette was stopped from going for competition. She was tested in a foreign country, and she was given very little information about the processes they did on her. In Uganda National Federation, officials took her to the hospital and made her undergo surgery without any informed consent. After surgery, she could no longer run. The side effect of the surgery was severe. Up to now, Annette is still sick, and she doesn't know how her future is going to be. Annette was left with a long life impact on her body up to now. This was not fair sports. It was a dehumanizing processes, which is not proper for human beings. Then after that, it started happening to me. In 2013, and later in 2014, I was picked by the Federation and taken to the hospital for a medical test. And I was not even given any explanation later. But after some time, I was told I needed medical steps. Invest on medical steps to run. The only reason I escaped what was supposed to happen to me because it had already happened to Annette. Because my coaches refused. They saw how Annette, I don't know if that is the way they need to eliminate us from sports and from the life we were given when we didn't know who we are supposed to be in this world or our body, how our body was supposed to be. In 2016, I was at my peak. I was running. I was ready for Olympics. But I was told my case was complicated. They could be telling me these things, but They don't explain to me anything. And I was left out of the national team that represented Uganda in that year's Olympic. If you do not change your body, you are removed from the national team. You are removed from the competition. You are removed from any running. If you refuse medication, you are excluded. 2016, when they stopped me from going for Olympics, I watched Caster Semenya, I watched Margaret Wambui, I watched Francine Nyashoba in Rio. And I felt what happened. I knew I was supposed to be there. But my federation officials didn't know that the rules were suspended because I was not told about it. Discussion taken at the international levels is often not communicated properly to the national federations. This caused harm. My opportunity to compete at the Olympics was taken. My dreams were shattered. But there is something else people must understand. These rules they put, it keeps changing. Under World Athletics, first you are allowed to compete, then you are banned again. Then you are allowed again, but no one informs your federation. Then you are told to reduce your testosterone or change your event, run shorter distance, or you go for long distance. Then after again, you are excluded from all those. You are told not to run completely. And now they have come up with a mandatory genetic testing for all women. The rules keep changing. And these changes impacted us the hardest. Confusion, fear, life-changing medical steps, careers put on hold, even ended completely. Public humiliation. If they hear about this, you are humiliated. You cannot move anywhere. They question you, questions you cannot answer. Identities questioned by everyone, putting us often at risk of persecution. In countries where human rights protection is limited, like Uganda here, we are not. The decision makers in Europe often had no clue about the impact athletes like me could face in a country like in Africa, mostly, like in Uganda here. I did not choose this. I was not sick. I was not a cheat, but I wanted to run. When people ask me why I'm not competing, I just tell them I did not qualify because I don't know how to explain the truth. But I'm speaking now because this is surely bigger than me. From where I see it, the future of sports is discriminatory. A system influenced by politics, not fairness. A system that uses invasive testing and strips away dignity. A system that not only excludes us, but it dehumanizes us, questions our existence in this world. A system that uses invasion testing and strips away our dignity. This is not fair sports. This is the dehumanization process. The system sees a woman winning and decides her body is the problem. They took away the medal from Caster. They took the career of athlete. They took the Olympics from me, of which I can never regain. I will never compete in the Olympics again. We are not the problems to be managed. We are not the bodies to be controlled. We are athletes. We are assigned female sex at birth, brought up as girls always, identified and competed as women. We are women and we deserve to run.
46XY-DSD is not a genetic variation amongst the female population that is to be celebrated in the same way as different wingspan or height or otherwise. Having testes is not a natural genetic variation within the female population. Number two, he said that 46XY-DSD are born female. What exactly does that mean? They're born 46XY with an SRY gene that leads to testes and eventually to male puberty. In a small minority of cases, because of bad medical advice, they are given a female gender identity, which most of them at puberty, when they realize that they have testes, not ovaries, they won't menstruate, they will produce sperm, they change their gender to male. And this idea that they haven't changed lane, and that's used as a reason to distinguish them from trans females. My understanding is that gender dysphoria for trans females can start from very early consciousness, and the only reason they don't change lanes is because they're too young, because of parental controls or otherwise. The idea there's no biological difference, none, no relevant biological difference, and so this idea that one hasn't changed lane and the other one's has is a nonsense. There's lots of arguments about the harms. The most interesting one was the harm that Jim identified was that you've denied these women victories and earnings. Those require fair competition conditions in order to justify winning prizes for females. All of the arguments that are made about proportionality are important and need to be made, just as they were under the old rules, made and lost. They need to be made again. And what you got to remember about proportionality is it has to be weighed against the objective that the rule is trying to achieve. And any restrictions and any effects are justified if they are necessary and proportionate to the achievement of that aim. No one has said anything to me that suggests that it isn't necessary to have this rule in order to preserve fair competition in the female category and therefore a fair and equal opportunity for females to enjoy the spoils and the benefits of sport. And because of that, if we have these arguments again, if we're repeating all of these arguments that were already made and lost, they'll be made and lost again.
Is a debate about what it means to be a biological woman or a biological male. And how do we define sex? And there's a comment in one of the threads about tying it around the production of eggs. And that is, in my view, a very slippery slope when we start linking what it means to be a female to the ability to reproduce. What's important to emphasize here when we're talking about women who have differences in sex development is that they are genetically different from a cis biological male, and there is no biological lane change. Why does that matter? Why is it relevant? Because they just want to run naturally the way that they're born. And then we lean into and start looking at, well, that's unfair. There's no fairness. But in sport, this concept of fairness is illusory. When we're assessing the proportional impact of these regulations, we have to bear in mind, I think Nancy used the example that a DSD athlete is 18,000 times more likely to win. But there's other genetic variations and mutations that also substantially improve the probability of success for athletes. There's the ACTN3 gene, which, as I understand it, every single Olympic level sprinter has in their body. If you don't have that gene, you are not competing at the Olympic level. There's EPO variations in genetics that provide for a 50% increase in lung capacity. And so in that context, we have to ask the question when we're dealing with human biology and genetics, what is fair? And there's this illusory concept that I think is difficult to pin down. And really that brings us back to where I started, which is the humanity of the issue. the impact of these regulations is so profound on individuals like Docus that we have to step back and ask, what are we doing? And when we look at, we heard Docus say that, talk about the confusion she's experienced through the course of her life, that the rules keep changing. But what really always strikes me and stands out is the humiliation, persecution, and lack of safety that she's experienced throughout the course of her life because of these rules. And I think that leads to really an application of what Dr. Payoshni talked about in her experience, is that these rules, by their existence, have the ability to perpetuate invasive and improper medical examinations and harm. They aren't enforced, implemented, or followed in a uniform way. And when we provide rules and support rules that have people look at how someone looks, and based on that appearance, make judgments about whether they should be competing, we really enter into a dangerous era, which is some of the concerns and harm that you've heard from Docus. And I just bring it back to, this ends up being a massive human impact on the individuals who are affected that shouldn't be justified.
There are two bodily systems that people have. So one system produces eggs, the other one produces sperm. So even if somebody doesn't produce eggs or can't produce sperm, that doesn't mean that they're not either in one of those two categories. I agree with Dorcas that we can do a better job in how it is that we enforce these rules. But again, I get back to, there is no sport rule that is not enforced. It's like, how can it be that if in a weight category, somebody's 1 ounce over and they do not get to compete in the Olympics? And yet, if somebody has this huge variation, being 5 ARD, that they are allowed. So, but I think like how it's delivered and how we educate the Olympic population and how we deliver the news and how it is that, somebody's shepherded through the system is very important. I fully understand some of the harms that have been done to some of these athletes. I full on recognize that, but that is not a reason not to have sex testing and not to make sure that the women's category is preserved for females.
Talks about science which is overtly simplified. The science we are talking about in the context, particularly of athletes with TSD, is not clear. And scientists there is a consensus about it that the science is not adequate. But what we are not talking about is where there is clear evidence as to the harm caused on athletes who have been sex tested over and over again. And it is unfortunate that our federations or the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. Today I focused my deliberation on the Olympic Committee because that's what was our work. But if we start talking about the international federations as well, they have done very little to ensure that even these terrible policies that they come up with, that is implemented properly. There is no education. All the time, in spite of all the fight and all the the court cases that we have had against World Athletics, for example, I have been stepping in for World Athletics, trying to have conversations with National Federation to ensure safety of athletes. This is not supposed to be my job. This is supposed to be the job of the International Federation. It's their responsibility. Often even I had to explain their policies. Why can't they do that? They're not talking about their responsibilities. They're not talking about how they can implement these policies in a safe way. They're constantly talking about science, which is not clear at all. So let's focus on what we can do. The scientists should do their job. And once the evidence is there should be a policy. But what about how you have been causing harm over and over again, not only on athletes who are competing at the highest level, but the trickle-down effect, as Maria Bobendrith has been talking about in the chat, I can see. The trickle-down effect of these policies on any kid across the world. And let's talk over and over again about the global impact and not focus on one country that we are constantly doing.
We need just to look for a better solution, a better way for these athletes to have recognition in competition. They need to be equally treated like other athletes, because this talent, they're gifted with the talent when they were born. They did not just forge the talent, and they didn't know all this mess, these kind of things could happen. So we need protection. We need to be protected and even welcomed by everyone, because it is not a choice, but it was nature. That's why we are like that. So even what I need is our right to be. We should also have the right. They should not violate our rights, because we have been experiencing this since this rule came out. It started. We felt it even in testing. It was about drug testing. Even the way DSD athletes and these other athletes are tested is so different from the way these other girls are tested. So our rights were violated. So we also need the same rights like other people. So we also fear to be disrespected. At least we need some respect. At least when people are talking, let's speak with respect about these people. They are human beings, just like the way you are. They have rights. They were born. They were not told when they were in the womb that you are supposed to be like that. So you have the right to exist in this world, to compete, to get something for your family, to be like other people. Let us not talk because we are getting something from the offices we are in. We are getting something because we are big people in those places, because we don't have the relatives who are like those people, because if you have one relative and you tell the relative, you go and compete with these people in the men, I don't think someone could even speak that kind of things, like these athletes are supposed to be like this, they're like this. So they didn't want to be born the way they're born. They need protection, they need guidance, they need life like other people need life. We need equality, we need to be equally treated. Discrimination should be abolished. We need our dignity also to be recognized. We have lost dignity. We have lost a lot. The dreams, all the passion we have, desire, got wasted because we can no longer compete. We cannot support ourselves, our family. We are living like wild animals. We are not longer existing. We are not seen anywhere. That they need to look into it critically and think twice about the life people are living in this world, because it is not easy if your talent and what makes you happy are just cut short in that way.